Chapter 5. The Sealed Star Station. The doorway breathed cold. Not the ordinary cool of stone shade, nor the damp chill of a cellar kept from the sun. This cold had a thin metallic edge, as if the air inside the ruined station had been sleeping under old silver and had only just remembered how to move. It slipped over my wrists when I crossed the threshold and raised every small hair there. Marcus lifted a lamp from the gear pack and signaled the guards forward. 2 ahead, 1 at the rear. No one touches a wall, panel, or floor seam unless I say so. Felix muttered, if the walls glow, I should be permitted a scholarly exception. Marcus did not bother looking at him. You are the reason rules need names. The ruined dome chamber swallowed us in layers. From outside, the station had looked squat and half-buried, more relic than threat. Inside, it stretched deeper than the broken roofline suggested. The first chamber was circular, its lower half cut directly into the cliff stone and its upper ring built in fitted pale slabs that had once been polished smooth. Time and weather had done their work. Mineral streaks ran down the walls. Hairline cracks branched across the ceiling ribs. One side of the dome had collapsed inward, spilling old stone and windblown grit across the floor. Yet beneath the ruin, the shape of deliberate beauty remained. The walls were inlaid with worn silver lines that curved like route paths under cloud cover. Between them ran bands of carved motifs, stars opening into petal forms, braided winds, and the same underhook crossings I had seen in the birth mast and my mother's work. Not identical, never identical. Those in my mother's hands had always looked softened by use, adapted for living materials and fingers. These were older, more formal, as if the kingdom once expected even its hidden mechanisms to deserve grace. My boots sounded too loud on the stone. Julian came in just behind me. The last of the afternoon light caught his shoulder for a moment before the ruined doorway swallowed it. Then his face was lamplit instead, the deep blue of his eyes darkening in the cold interior. He looked toward the floor first, then up to the carved wall bands, taking in the structure the way he took in damage quietly, completely. Callie's had gone pale by the second step. This station should have been closed by royal seal. Felix was already crouching near the entry arch to inspect the twisted remains of the gate hinge. It was poorly respected, but yes. Marcus motioned one of the guards toward the cracked western wall where the filler resin had been shoved into a seam. Check the edge. Slowly, I moved toward the platform center without deciding to. The pull from my satchel strengthened there, not painful, only insistent, like a thread tightening when drawn across a loom. The chamber floor had once been a perfect ring. Now 1/4 of the outer circle had sunk under the cliff shift, leaving a shallow slope toward the center where grit, broken roof tiles, and years of dust had gathered in a pale crescent. Half buried under that drift lay an inner dais of darker stone, its outline barely visible under the debris. I crouched and brushed the dust back with my glove. Silver flashed. Not bright, not alive yet. Dormant lines sleeping just beneath the surface, arranged in a circular pattern like a crown laid flat and widened into architecture. A ring within a ring. The same logic in different scale. Felix saw and made a helpless noise of delight. There, the central plate. Is it active? Julian asked. Felix hesitated. Not properly, or not fully. There is residual charge at most. Enough to answer local pressure perhaps, if the housing still connects to. Something clinked behind us. Everyone turned. One of the guards had pried loose a chunk of the brittle filler resin from the wall seam. Behind it, in the narrow cavity between the inner stone and the cliff face, lay a small metal tool wrapped in old cloth. Not an ancient tool. A modern pry hook, the sort used for crate bands and dock fastenings, its tip blunted by misuse. Marcus took it with a gloved hand and held it to the lamp. Recent enough. Hallie's swallowed. Then someone from the yards came up here. Or someone who wished it to look like someone from the yards, Marcus said. He passed the hook to Julian, who turned it once in his fingers and exposed the handle mark where cloth had been tied for grip. Dark residue stained the wood. Felix leaned over. Resin dust and mineral grit. "No," I said before I could stop myself. They all looked at me. I stepped closer, took the hook when Julian offered it, and held the handle nearer the lamp. The dark stain was not only dust. A faint scent clung to it beneath the stone and mold, sharp, sweet, and oily at once. "This was treated," I said. "Not for preservation. For the hands." Felix frowned. "Why would anyone oil a pry hook?" "They didn't oil it. They scented it." I rubbed my thumb carefully over the wrap. "We use variations of this in workshops sometimes when tools will be gripped for hours. Clove resin, bitter leaf, sometimes amber oil if someone wants to waste money. Keeps sweat from souring the handle." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "That smell again." I looked up. "What smell?" "The records chest in the counting hall," he said. "The latch edge. Same sweetness under the brass." I thought it was warehouse spoilage at the time. Callie's went pale enough to look lit from within. That cabinet held only local route talas. "Then someone cared very much about local route talas," Marcus said. He handed the pry hook back to a guard without taking his eyes off the chamber wall. "You can explain your cupboards later. First we see what they were trying to open." The pull at my satchel sharpened so suddenly it made me catch my breath. Not toward the damaged seam now, toward the half-buried central plate under the dust. Julian saw it on my face at once. "Center?" "Yes." I stepped down the shallow slope and knelt by the darker stone. Beneath the grit, the inlaid silver lines did not form a fixed pattern after all. They ran around a narrow recessed channel, as if something thin and circular had once been seated there and lifted away cleanly. Felix dropped to one knee opposite me, lamp shaking in his hand from excitement. "It's a receiving ring," he whispered. "Not ornament. Something was meant to be seated here." My fingers were already inside the satchel. I drew out the wrapped remains of the crown and peeled back the cloth. What had once been white star bloom and frostbell was mostly ruin now, bruised petals browned at the edges from storm salt handling, and too many impossible nights. Only the inner silver held its shape, a fine loop still threaded through one broken floral segment like memory refusing burial. "Will it answer?" Julian asked. I swallowed. "It has every other time." I stripped the dead petals away carefully and felt a ridiculous stab of apology with each one. By the time I finished, all that remained in my hands was the narrow silver loop and one snapped stem crossing it at the side. The metal had gone cold enough to bite. When I laid it into the channel, the fit was exact. The whole plate shuddered. Light did not burst this time. It gathered. Thin silver ran from the seated loop through the inlaid lines and stalled at the center, waiting. I looked up at Julian and knew before either of us spoke that the station wanted from him what the harbor crown and the prowbind had wanted before: answer, not witness. He came down beside me without ceremony, dust and palace silk and all the rest of it forgotten. "Tell me where." "There." I touched the dark center stone. "I think it needs both." Julian set his palm against the center. For one breath nothing happened. Then the old silver under-glass mirror woke like a line of stars dragged suddenly through deep water. The recessed ring flashed white. The center stone answered. The carved wall bands lit in sequence, underhooks and petal forms racing one another around the chamber until the broken dome shone from within. Callie stumbled back with a curse. Felix made a sound no dignified scholar should ever make in public. Stone moved under us with a deep internal click. The central plate split along a seam so fine it had hidden under centuries of dust, and a curved section sank inward to reveal a narrow stair winding into the cliff below. Marcus recovered first. "Guards with me." Slow. We went down into a chamber that had never been meant for weather or ordinary eyes. The air there was colder and cleaner. Half the room was taken by dormant crystal veins and silver thread housings stretched in radial lines from a central mirror well. The other half held record panels of pale stone inset with strips of dark metal, each strip etched so finely it looked written with a needle instead of a chisel. The moment Julian and I stepped onto the lower ring together, the nearest panel bloomed with light. Not modern script. Older. The characters opened in strokes first, then resolved themselves into words I could read, as if the station were translating its own memory for us. Felix read aloud before anyone could stop him. Glassmere West Auxiliary Station. Authorized pairing, crown line and woven line. Maintenance custody, route steward and starweaver assigned. The last word went through the room like a blade drawn half from its sheath. Starweaver. My mother's lullaby rose in me so sharply I almost heard it outside my own head. Not the melody alone. The rhythm of her fingers under thread, the pause before the hidden crossing, the old certainty that some things were taught by hand because names could be cut out of records more easily than living habit. A second line of light climbed the panel. Seal breach recorded. Outer maintenance ring removed by unauthorized hand. Local line interference confirmed. Marcus swore under his breath. Felix stopped breathing long enough to count as impressive. Callie stared at the words as if he might somehow argue them back into stone. Far above us, from beyond the buried ceiling and the cliff outside, a bell rang from the lumina, one long clean note instead of an alarm. Then another answered from the harbor tower below. The route line over Glassmere had steadied. I looked down at the silver loop seated in the lower ring. The last browned petal caught in its crossing blackened soundlessly and fell away. When I lifted the metal free, it came with me bare and bright, no longer a broken crown at all, only a narrow loop of living silver warm from the station's answer. Felix turned to Julian with his whole face alight. Your Highness, this changes everything. Julian's gaze was still on the lit panel. Yes, he said quietly. That is why it will be fought. We had scarcely climbed back into the upper chamber when a signal flare burned against the broken dome opening palace blue, sharp as a blade in the darkening air. One of the deck guards caught the coded mirror flash from the cliff edge and swore. Marcus took the message, read it once, and passed it to Julian with a look that had gone flat with displeasure. Immediate return to Violia. Council session on arrival. The Starsea Ball proceeds tonight. They want your Highness visible. And me, I thought, though the message did not need to say it aloud. Not after the harbor. Not after this. Julian folded the slip once. The old station light still silvered one side of his face. We leave within the quarter hour, he said. I closed my hand around the bare loop I had taken from the ring below. The station under Glassmere had opened. The route line had answered. Someone had already tried to gut the place and hide the wound. And now the palace wanted music, silk, and smiles laid over the top of it before the truth had even cooled. Chapter 6. The Starsea Ball. The ballroom looked like someone had broken open the night sea and poured it indoors. Light moved everywhere. Not torchlight, not the fixed white glow of palace corridors, but 100 softer gleams thrown by suspended crystal globes and mirrored panels set high in the domed ceiling. They drifted and trembled above the room like stars seen through dark water. The floor beneath them was polished black glass veined with silver, so smooth it held reflections almost too perfectly. Every step set constellations moving underfoot. I stood at the edge of that false sea in a borrowed gown, my hands folded so tightly at my waist that the fine fabric there had already begun to crease. No matter what the attendants had done to me, my body refused to forget it was mine. The dress was pale silver blue, the color of route light caught just before dawn burned it away. It had been chosen, the head attendant told me, because stronger jewel tones would swallow me and heavy gold would turn me into something I was not. The compliment should have pleased me. Instead it made my stomach knot tighter. The fabric skimmed my skin like cool water and moved when I breathed, all lightness and expense and certainty that the body inside it had been born for rooms like this. Mine had not. My hair, which usually lived its life tied back out of the way with ribbon or pins I could lose without mourning, had been coaxed into a twist low at the nape with loose lengths left to soften it. I did not understand how the attendants had done it. I only knew that when one of them had turned me toward the mirror in the dressing chamber, I had stared at my own face as if a stranger had put it on for the evening and might want it returned later. I had refused jewels beyond the smallest pair of crystal drops because crystal did not sneer at me the way diamonds probably would have. I had refused scented powder stronger than a hint of winter lily because too much perfume felt like lying. I had refused, quite firmly, the attendant's suggestion of a full ceremonial tiara arrangement. In the end, after the room had fallen into the polite kind of dismay palace women reserve for guests who reject excellent nonsense, I had taken out the cloth bundle from my satchel, unwound the small silver loop I had carried back from Glassmere, and rebuilt it. Not into a crown. I was not mad. Only into a narrow side comb worked with 3 fresh white star blooms from the palace conservatory and 1 small frostbill spray set low enough not to look as if I had mistaken myself for nobility. The silver in the comb had once bound the crown that flared in Julian's hands at the harbor and woke the station under Glassner's cliff. The flowers were new. The silver was not. When I tucked the piece into my hair myself and stepped away from the mirror, I looked less polished than the attendants wanted. More myself. That had to be enough. It did not feel like enough now. The Starsea Ball had gathered half the upper world into one room. Lords in dark coats threaded with silver insignia stood in clusters near the music dais, their decorations flashing when they turned. Ladies moved through the light in satin and silk and pearl mist, skirts carrying the colors of frost, moonlight, deep water, and expensive fruit flesh. Their laughter rose and fell like something rehearsed to sound effortless. Even the servants seemed made of cleaner lines tonight, gliding at the room's edges with trays of cut crystal and silver stemware full of pale sparkling wines. And everywhere there were stars, set into the ceiling, woven into cuffs, stitched into hems, floating in lantern globes, reflected on glass. The kingdom's favorite lie looked magnificent when dressed well enough that because the sky above us glittered, the structures beneath must surely be just. A quartet of strings played near the far wall, joined by a glass harmonium whose notes shivered through the room like chilled light. Couples moved in ordered turns across the ballroom floor, gliding over reflections of false constellations as if born with music in their blood and no fear at all of misstepping. I could have built 3 dozen festival crowns in the time it took those people to complete one turn around the room. Breathe. I turned. Felix stood half in shadow beside a pillar worked with silver vine carving, wearing formal evening black with a scholar's silver clasp at the collar and the unmistakable expression of a man who would have preferred to keep his notes and abandon his body elsewhere. He looked almost respectable from across the room. Up close, his hair had already fought free from whatever arrangement some long-suffering servant had attempted, and one glove sat crooked at the wrist because he had clearly put it on while reading something. "I am breathing," I said. "You are breathing like a woman considering whether she can fake sudden death decorously." "That is because I am." He glanced past me at the dancers, then back. "Reasonable. Still inconvenient. You adapt quickly." I was trained by scholarly banquets. Same beasts, better wine. That won a short breath of laughter out of me, which was likely his goal. Felix had spent most of the return voyage in a state that hovered between furious exhilaration and abstracted muttering. If anyone had expected him to recover gently from discovering an active pre-erasure Starweaver station, they did not know him at all. By the time the Lumina had docked at Firelea, he had already drafted 3 separate notes for the archive, crossed them all out for incompleteness, and started a 4th in handwriting so aggressive it nearly tore the page. The palace had received us with exactly as much grace as an institution could manage when forced to welcome truth at the same time as ceremony. We had landed under evening light, been swept not to rest but to council briefings, deposition chambers, record review, and a half-dozen conversations in which senior officials tried very hard to sound as if the buried history under glass mirror was grave and regrettable without sounding as if any living office ought to answer for it immediately. Julian had not let them. I had seen him tired before. In the harbor, on the Lumina after the storm edge, in the route records room with too many maps open at once and no hour left in the night. But the Julian who stood in the council chamber with station evidence laid before him had seemed made of some colder, harder part of his own gentleness. He had not raised his voice. He had not pounded tables or reached for princely outrage. He had only refused, again and again, to let anyone reduce what we found into administrative dust. I had been dismissed after my statement with orders to rest and prepare for the ball. Rest had not happened. Preparation had. Now I stood in the middle of the result and wanted very much to be back on Glassmere where at least the rot smelled honest. "You are not supposed to linger here alone," Felix said. "I am not alone. You have me, yes." A questionable form of protection. I looked out over the room again. Eyes touched me and slid away, then returned. Some curious, some amused, some openly disapproving in the elegant way of people too trained to stare rudely and too offended not to try. Rumors had reached the ballroom ahead of me. Of course they had. The harbor accident, the route disruptions, the workshop girl summoned to the palace, the swift departure on the Lumina, the emergency return, the prince choosing to bring me into official chambers instead of removing me from them. In a court like this, gossip moved faster than route light and with less regard for collisions. "Do they all know?" I asked quietly. Felix followed my gaze. "That depends which part you mean. Some know you traveled with us. Some know you were present at the harbor flare. Some know there was a Western route stabilization event this afternoon and are currently inventing explanations that preserve both their comfort and their positions. And the rest? The rest know only that the Crown Prince insisted a Middle Island artisan attend his first dance set at the Star Sea Ball, which in this room may be the most explosive fact of all." I looked at him sharply. "His first dance set?" Felix blinked. "You didn't know." "I know many things," I said. "They are simply all becoming inconvenient at once." For the first time all evening, true panic moved under my skin. The first dance at a ball like this was not a thing. It was a declaration disguised as courtesy. A prince could distribute meaning with a bow faster than a clerk could with 30 sealed orders. Everyone in the room knew that. Everyone except, apparently, the woman in the borrowed dress. Felix's expression sharpened into something closer to alarm. "He did not tell you." "No." He exhaled slowly. "That is unlike him." I stared at the moving sea of silk and glass and reflected stars, and somewhere across that shifting brightness I felt, more than saw, the room pull tighter around a possibility I had not been warned I was standing inside. "Why would he do that?" I asked. Felix did not answer at once, which was answer enough. Then, perhaps because he had always been too curious to lie gracefully, he said, "Because he means things when he does them." That was not comfort either. Music shifted. The current dance ended in a sweep of skirts and measured bows. Servants glided in at the room's edges to refresh glasses and remove what little disorder elegance ever permitted itself. A rustle ran through the gathered nobility, too subtle to call collective, too widespread to ignore. Someone had entered from the upper doors. I did not need Felix to tell me who. Julian moved through the ballroom like a line drawn cleanly through water. He wore formal black tonight rather than route navy, though the cut of the coat still favored motion more than ornament. Silver work crossed the collar and cuffs in restrained star patterns that caught the light only when he turned. No jeweled overstatement. No velvet excess. The simplicity made him more visible, not less. His pale hair carried the ballroom's star glow until it seemed to gather there. His face looked almost too composed under the shifting mirrors, except I knew now what the room could not, that the calm cost him something, especially after rout strain and sleeplessness and an evening spent forcing truth into unwilling ears. He paused just within the doors while a senior chamberlain spoke to him. Around him, heads tilted, shoulders subtly adjusted, conversations reshaped themselves to include or exclude at speed. He answered whatever the chamberlain said with one brief nod and then looked out over the ballroom. His gaze found me at once. Not after a survey. Not after polite duty to the room. At once. Something changed in the ballroom then. Not in the music, not in the chandeliers, not in any visible mechanism. In attention. The kind of shift animals sense before a storm front arrives. Julian started toward me. I had time to regret 3 separate things before he reached me. Wearing the silver-blue dress. Letting the attendants powder my wrists. Not asking Felix to tie me to the pillar until morning. He stopped a proper distance away, though in the full force of the ballroom's notice there was no such thing as a proper distance anymore. "You look as if the room has personally insulted you," he said. His voice was quiet, meant for me, but there was no mistaking the warmth in it. "It has," I said. Repeatedly. The smallest smile touched his mouth. It changed him more than the mirrors did. "I apologize on its behalf." "That seems inadequate." I suspected as much. I should not have noticed the tiredness under his eyes first. I did anyway. Not because the rest of him failed. Because it did not. Because even worn thin around the edges by responsibility, he held himself with that same careful steadiness I had seen on the lumina and in the station light, and the sight of it did something dangerous to my chest. "You have not slept," I said before wisdom could save me. "Not enough. Have you eaten?" Felix says I answer questions about food as if they are assassination attempts. I was correct, Felix said. Julian spared him a brief glance. "You usually are in the most irritating possible manner." Then his attention returned to me, and the ballroom might as well have vanished for the way it pressed at the edges of my awareness without entering it. "I am sorry," he said, and this time I knew he did not mean the room. For what? For the fact that this evening became unavoidable. I thought of the council chamber, of older nobles pretending not to glance at me while discussing sealed history, of the way one senior lady had asked whether artisans were always so direct as if I were not standing there. I thought of being laced into a dress while attendants discussed which jewels would best reduce my background without using exactly those words. "It became unavoidable before the dress," I said. His eyes changed at that, deepening somehow, and he lowered his voice further. "I know." He knew. Of course he knew. It only made him more impossible to survive. I could feel the room waiting now. Not literally silent. The quartet had begun the next piece, servants still moved, glasses still chimed faintly. Yet the social body of the ballroom had drawn taut around us like sailcloth before a wind strike. People might pretend to look elsewhere. They were listening with every polished nerve in their bodies. Julian extended his hand. "May I have the first dance?" There it was. No performance around it. No flourish. Just the words, offered simply enough that for one stupid heartbeat I could almost believe they were private. My own heart answered in violence. Across the room, I heard a woman inhale sharply. Somewhere farther right, a man stopped speaking mid-sentence. The quartet did not falter, but only because professional musicians are paid to behave like structural supports for other people's disasters. I looked at Julian's hand, then at his face. He knew exactly what this meant. I saw it in the clarity of his gaze, in the stillness with which he held himself, in the absence of apology for the act itself. He had not forgotten to warn me. He had chosen not to burden the invitation with explanation before the invitation existed. Whether that was kindness or recklessness, I could not yet decide. "Your Highness," I said, and my voice was too soft. Every person in this room is watching. I'm aware. And you are still asking. Yes. Felix, who should have fled several minutes earlier for his own safety, became suddenly fascinated by a passing tray of candied citrus and moved away without looking, as though he were moving away. Coward. Sensible coward. Julian waited. He did not use rank as pressure. Did not let the room's attention do his work for him. Only waited. My hand moved before caution fully assembled itself. His fingers closed around mine. Warm, steady, more careful than any prince had the right to be in a ballroom full of knives hidden in lace and silk. He led me onto the floor. The walk from the edge of the room to the first dance line could not have been long. It lasted an age. I felt every eye turn, every whisper knot and split, every calculation bloom behind composed faces. I did not trip. I took pride in that because the alternative was fainting under a chandelier and becoming a proverb. When we reached the dance line, the master of music gave the slightest startled correction to the quartet and the room opened around us by reflex. Partners shifted. Space formed. Julian placed one hand lightly at my back and took my other in the formal hold as if he had done so 100 times and would never presume beyond what I allowed. The floor's black glass reflected us in broken silver. I hated how much I wanted to keep standing there. The first figure began. I knew the basic pattern. Every Middle Island girl who ever dreamed above her station learns the skeleton of court dances whether she has reason to or not. You pick it up from festival performances, from watching high weddings in public plazas, from one aunt who once served 2 floors below nobility and still corrects everyone's posture 20 years later. Knowing a pattern in theory, however, is not the same thing as dancing it opposite the crown prince while an entire ballroom measures the distance between your berth and his hand. Julian must have felt the tension running through me, because his thumb shifted once against my palm in the smallest grounding pressure. "Do not look at them," he said. "I would prefer not to fall." "Then look at me." That did not help at all. It made everything worse. Still, I did as told. His eyes were darker in the mirrored ballroom than they had been in the daylight above Glassmere. Not colder, only deeper, the blue of clear sky after dusk when the first star appears and you cannot yet tell whether it promises direction or trouble. He moved with the polished assurance of a man trained from childhood never to misplace a step in public, but there was nothing empty in it. No ornamental ease. He adjusted to me as if the dance mattered less than whether I could breathe inside it. The first turn came. He guided without drugging. The second sweep carried us past a line of lords and ladies who had clearly abandoned all pretense of not staring. The music rose, bright and cool, glass harmonium threading silver over the strings until the whole room felt suspended in a bowl of frozen starlight. "You should have warned me," I murmured. "I considered it." "That is not the same." "No," he said. "It isn't." "Then why didn't you?" His expression did not alter, but I felt the answer gather in him before he spoke. "Because if I had told you before I asked, you would have thought only about the room." That was infuriating. It was also true. The next figure brought us apart and together again, one measured step between us, then 2, then his hand at my back once more. Beneath the light and glass and music, the warmth of that contact burned too clearly through the thin silk. "I still am thinking about the room," I said. "I know. You are impossible. I have heard that today." There it was again, that flash of dry warmth I had first seen at the harbor when the crown lit in his hand. It made him seem more real than any formal portrait ever could. More human. More dangerous. We turned through the center of the floor, and I caught sight of the upper galleries where late arrivals clustered behind silver railwork to observe without committing themselves. Faces shifted in and out behind mirror light. A group of younger ladies whispered behind fans. One older lord near the pillar line had the distinct expression of a man recalculating alliances faster than the music could count. At the far west edge of the room, Felix had joined the scholars and looked as if he would rather study a live storm cell than survive small talk with them. Then I saw her. Lady Vivienne Harrow stood near the second mirrored arch beneath a hanging globe of star lamps, and the room around her seemed, annoyingly, to understand what beauty was for. I had expected something sharper, something obvious. A woman made entirely of dangerous angles and superior breeding. Instead, Vivienne looked as if she had been composed by a very patient artist who understood restraint better than anyone else in the ballroom. Her gown was deep midnight green, nearly black until the light struck the silk and let hidden blue emerge. No childish glitter, no desperate display. Pearls lay cool at her throat, and her dark hair was drawn up in a style so clean it made the effort behind it disappear. She stood very straight, one gloved hand resting against a closed fan, her face calm enough to be unreadable if not for the intelligence in it. She was watching us. Not smiling. Not scowling. Watching. The look held no cheap jealousy. It was worse than that. Assessment without malice. The sort of gaze a skilled merchant turns on a rare object before deciding whether the market around it has any idea of its value. I missed a step. Only half a step. Julian caught the correction before the figure visibly broke, turning it into a smoother pivot than I deserved. "Careful," he murmured. I saw someone. His eyes flicked briefly over my shoulder, found what I had found, and returned to me. Vivienne. So he saw her too. The music swelled. We passed a group of political wives whose silence as we turned before them could have stripped paint. "You say her name as if I should already know how not to react," I said. "I say it because pretending otherwise would insult us both." That was not helpful. It was, however, honest. The next sequence drew us farther down the floor. My skirt whispered over the glass in cool silk arcs lighter than any work clothes had the right to be. With each turn, the ballroom's reflections broke and remade themselves around us. Stars overhead, stars underfoot, stars caught in the mirrors until it looked as if we were dancing inside a hollowed sphere of night. This, I thought bitterly, was how courts survived. By making beauty so complete that people forgave the hands arranging the lie. Then Julian's thumb pressed once at my back when another cluster of whispers rose, and my thoughts broke open in a different direction entirely. Not all of this is lie. That was the problem. The palace's cruelty did not cancel its grace. The kingdom's history had buried the star weavers and still made room for stations beautiful enough to make my throat ache. Julian had been shaped by these halls and was not hollow in spite of them. He was what happened when a kind man learned to carry inherited structures without pretending they were clean. It would have been easier if he had been merely pretty. "Your shoes hurt," he said suddenly. I blinked. "What?" "They hurt." "No, you shift weight to the outside of your left foot when they hurt." Heat climbed my throat so fast it might have counted as fever. "Are you inspecting my balance now?" "I am trying to prevent your suffering from becoming public spectacle." "That is very noble of you." His mouth curved. "I am occasionally accused of that." The dance took us down the central line again. We passed within a few paces of Vivienne this time. She inclined her head the smallest degree, neither warm nor cold, acknowledging me as one would acknowledge another woman rather than a rumor. That should not have mattered. It did. I returned the inclination before I could second-guess it. When we turned away, Julian said, "She is not your enemy." I looked up sharply. That sounds dangerously like warning. It is truth. In this room, those often wear the same shoes. The faintest shadow of weariness crossed his face, not directed at me but at the room and what it asked of him. "I know." There, in the center of the ballroom, while silver music climbed around us and half the kingdom watched, I understood with a fresh unpleasant clarity that Julian did not merely dislike the pressures of his rank in some vague noble way. He despised the machinery by which affection, politics, bloodline, and duty were all expected to collapse into one obedient decision. The anger was quiet in him. That made it stronger. The dance slowed toward its final figure. I did not want it to end. I hated that. Because the moment it ended, the ballroom would remember itself as a battlefield and not merely a room full of light. Julian drew me into the closing turn, closer than the earlier patterns required, though not enough to break propriety unless someone desired an excuse to be offended. Many people did. I could feel them readying the offense in advance. "Cora," he said softly. The sound of my name on his mouth inside that glittering, hostile room nearly undid me. "What?" His gaze held mine with terrifying steadiness. "I asked you because I wished to dance with you. Not because of optics. Not because the court needed something staged. Not because the route case required a visible witness. Because he wished it." The words struck deeper than if he had called me beautiful or brave, or any of the other things men say when they want the effect of sincerity without surrendering anything real. I did not know what expression crossed my face then, only that his eyes changed in answer to it, softening and darkening at once in a way that made the ballroom vanish for one aching breath. Then the figure ended. The room exhaled. Applause rose, polite and sharp-edged. Not for us, not exactly. For the completion of the set, for music well played, for the court's ability to clap while calculating. Julian released me only as much as etiquette demanded and bowed with perfect form. I curtsied because years of surviving customers had taught my body how to perform civility even while drowning. When I rose, the ballroom had resumed motion around us, but the current had changed. We were no longer merely among it. We had become one of the things it moved around. Julian offered his arm. "Walk with me." It was phrased like invitation. It was also our only protection short of flight. We moved toward the terrace doors at the east side of the ballroom where cooler air drifted in from an open colonnade overlooking the palace gardens. People parted. Not dramatically. Court hostility is too mannered for drama when subtler cuts are available. Still, I felt the path open around us in a wave of trained deference and sharpened curiosity. It gave me too much time to hear the murmurs. First set after Glassmere, of all times that girl from the harbor quarter. If the rumors are true about the route station heroes will not enjoy this, surely only gratitude. There it was. The safest way to explain any breach in order, reduce it to favor, debt, benevolence bestowed downward. That way the structure stays intact. The prince can dance with a common-born woman as long as everyone agrees the act means only his kindness and never her value. I must have stiffened because Julian's arm under my fingers adjusted closer to offering support without claiming it. On the terrace, the air felt cleaner at once. The colonnade overlooked a descending garden of star lantern pools and night-blooming white vines trained over silver arches. Beyond the lower balustrade, the Capitol spread in layers of light under the deepening sky. Evening had ripened fully while we danced. The first real route lines of night floated above the outer islands like silver threads drawn taut across darkness. That sight should have calmed me. Instead, looking at the living routes after what we had found under Glassmere made something in my chest pull tight and sore. Beauty again. Always beauty, over and through everything. Hard to hate, harder to trust. Julian led me to the edge of the terrace where the music reached us, softened by distance and stone. For a few breaths no one followed close enough to interrupt. The ballroom remained visible behind us through the open doors, all stars and black glass and moving silk. In kinder circumstances, the terrace might have granted us privacy and relief. It granted neither. Only thinner company. "You should have told me," I said again. He rested one hand on the balustrade and looked out over the city before answering. "I know. That is not nearly enough apology for a ballroom ambush. It was not meant as ambush. What was it meant as?" His profile held in the terrace light, silvered at the edges by lantern glow from the garden below. The wind moved one pale strand of hair at his temple. He looked tired enough to break my heart if I let myself think about it too long, and determined enough to keep moving long after wiser men would have slept or yielded or lied. It was meant, he said at last, as refusal. I stared at him. He turned then. The council would have preferred tonight pass as if you were incidental. A witness used in private chambers, thanked discreetly, then returned to your work while they debated route reform among the same people who let the old stations rot. His voice remained soft. That made every word land harder. I would not let them reduce you to something useful only when unseen. The night seemed to sharpen around us. My pulse beat once, hard enough to hurt. That is not a small thing to do in this room, I said. No. You could have made half the court your enemy. His expression changed by only a degree. I suspect fewer than half. That almost made me laugh. Almost. Then the rest of what he said finished reaching me, and with it came the painful, dangerous warmth of being defended not as an object of kindness, but as a person who ought not be hidden. My throat tightened. I looked away before he could see how badly the words struck. Below us the palace gardens shone in carefully placed points of white. Beyond them, over the lower harbor, route lines gleamed clear now against the dark. It still hurts, I said. He did not ask what. He knew. Yes, he said. That simple acknowledgement undid something in me that reassurance would have left locked. I looked back through the terrace doors and saw the room as the others must be seeing it, the prince and the artisan standing apart after the first dance set, too close to dismiss, too public to explain away cleanly. Behind the shifting silk and mirrored light, Lady Vivienne had moved nearer the central arch. She was speaking to an older matron now, listening more than answering. Even at this distance I could see the composure in the line of her shoulders. Not brittle. Controlled. Does she wish to marry you? I asked before I could stop myself. The question hung between us, indecently direct. Julian's eyes went to Vivienne and then returned to me. That is a more complicated question than this terrace deserves. Then give it a more honest answer than the room would. His mouth curved faintly, though no amusement reached his eyes. Very well. She wishes to keep her house powerful. She wishes the kingdom not to fall into the hands of fools. She wishes to stand where she can influence outcomes rather than decorate them. As for me, he paused. I think she would rather be respected than romanticized. That was not the answer of a man nursing some secret soft attachment to his political bride. Relief moved through me so fast it made me ashamed of itself. You respect her, I said. Yes. I looked again toward Vivienne. She had not once glared at me, not once made herself the easy villain of the room. Somehow that made the whole thing worse. If she had been petty, I could have hated her cleanly. Instead, she stood in perfect silk with a mind visible beneath it and a place in the kingdom no one would question. The sort of woman the ballroom understood on sight. The sort I would never be, no matter how many palace attendants pinned my hair. I hate that this room makes everything mean three things at once, I said. Julian's gaze rested on me with that painful gentleness again. Only three? I let out a breath that might have become laughter in kinder circumstances. The respite ended there. A cluster of nobles approached the terrace with the smooth inevitability of weather moving over water. Their timing was too practiced to be accidental. At the front walked Minister Orrin Veilcourt in formal dark silk, every fold immaculate, his expression composed into gracious concern. Beside him came Lord Sunward of the West Chains, a silver-haired political relic who looked as if he had been born already disapproving, and Lady Marybeth Hollow, whose smile was so polished it could probably reflect treachery from several angles at once. A few others drifted in their wake. Not enough to form a crowd, enough to become a public arrangement. Julian saw them and did not move away from me. That choice cost him. I could feel it, not in reluctance toward me but in the way his shoulders settled minutely as one does before taking a blow one has been expecting since the doors opened. Your Highness, Warren said with a bow precise enough to offend in its perfection. Forgive the interruption. I feared you were being stolen entirely from your guests. Then fear less often, Minister, Julian said. Lady Hollow laughed lightly, delighted to pretend tension was wit. His Highness is severe tonight. The line of Oren's mouth adjusted by less than a smile. The kingdom has given him reason. His eyes came to me then, not lingering over dress or jewels or the surface of me at all. He looked the way he always did, as if one should apologize for containing any unmeasured variable. Miss Belrose, he said. Minister, no one invited me to leave. That was deliberate too. If Oren had wanted privacy, he could have arranged it. He wanted witnesses. The whole court wanted witnesses tonight. It only disagreed on which truth ought to be witnessed. Lord Sunward, who had likely never carried anything heavier than old prejudice in his life, bowed just enough to count. The Western reports speak highly of your presence of mind. I knew a blade wrapped in silk when I heard one. Glassmere needed more than reports, I said. Lady Hollow's smile deepened. How practical. Julian's voice remained mild. That was rather the problem. Oren rested one hand on the terrace rail. Indeed. Which is why tonight's appearances matter so much. There it was. The turn. Not to the station evidence. Not to route policy. To appearances. To what the room had already decided was safer terrain. The court has been deeply unsettled by recent instability, he continued. Not merely in the routes, but in confidence. Merchant houses strain. Peripheral lords grow anxious. The old balance of trust between crown, nobility, and the systems that keep the islands joined has shown itself more fragile than most wished to believe. Julian said nothing. That, I was learning, was one of the ways he gave dangerous men room enough to condemn themselves. Lady Hollow sighed softly toward the night. And in times of fragility, symbols become anchors. Oren inclined his head as if she had spoken usually. Precisely. I knew then where he intended to go. So did Julian. So, I suspect, did half the ballroom, pretending not to lean subtly closer through the open doors. The minister's gaze remained on the prince, but he pitched his voice to carry just enough. The kingdom requires reassurance, Your Highness. Stability in governance. Stability in route administration. Stability in the succession. These matters are not separate, however much sentiment prefers them so. He paused, and only then let his eyes touch me again. A future consort must not merely charm a room. She must bind great houses, quiet rival interests, and give the realm confidence in blood as well as affection. The pain of it was not in the insult. He was too skilled for that. It lay in the elegance. No crude dismissal. No vulgar reminder of my birth. He did not need either. He only set the architecture of power out in the open and let me stand outside it in my silver blue dress while everyone watched the distance between us become measurable. Lady Hollow lowered her lashes as if saddened by necessity. Lord Sunward looked grimly pleased to hear the world sound proper again. Behind them, a younger nobleman stared into his wineglass with the avid discomfort of someone too interested in the spectacle to meet its eye directly. My hand, still resting lightly on Julian's arm, went cold. The ballroom behind us seemed suddenly much farther away. All the star lantern light, all the music, all the glittering floor turned thin as foil. Borrowed dress. Borrowed room. Borrowed air. Not because Julian had made any of it false. Because Oren had, with exquisite cleanliness, reminded the night what it considered real. Julian's jaw tightened once. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. That made the reply more dangerous. How curious, he said, that your definition of stability always arrives dressed as obedience to the same tired arrangement. Oren bowed his head slightly. I define stability by what keeps the kingdom from fracture. No, Julian said. You define it by what keeps certain men comfortable while others bear the cost. That changed the air, but not enough to erase the wound Oren had opened. Not in me. Not in the watching room. The minister spread one hand. I speak only of political arithmetic, Your Highness. No personal slight was intended. That almost made me laugh. Because of course it was not personal. That was exactly what made it cut so deeply. Personal slights can be thrown back. Structures are harder. Julian's arm under my fingers had gone very still. I had felt him angry before, but always outward-facing, at rotten ledgers, at buried history, at route negligence dressed as procedure. This anger was different, colder, sharper, directed not only at Oren's words but at the fact that they had landed where he could not shield me without giving the room another spectacle to feed on. Lady Hollow shifted delicately. Surely no one here doubts Miss Belrose's courage. No one answered. Which was answer enough. I looked through the terrace doors again. Lady Vivienne stood no longer by the mirrored arch. She had moved closer without seeming to move, now just inside the ballroom threshold where the light caught the line of her jaw and the dark silk at her shoulders. She had heard Oren. Of course she had. Her expression did not soften into pity, which I would have hated. But there was something in it I had not expected, displeasure, sharp and contained. Not at me, at what was being done. She lowered her fan once against her skirt, a tiny hard motion, and for the first time I believed what Julian had said. She was not my enemy. That did not make her less dangerous. It only made the room more complicated than any easy judgment would allow. I withdrew my hand from Julian's arm. Not dramatically, not as rejection, because if I kept touching him while Oren laid out blood, houses, and future consorts like route calculations, I thought I might either say something wild or break in front of them all. Neither would please me. The loss of contact hit harder than it should have. Julian felt it too. I saw it in the brief flicker of his gaze downward and back. A tiny thing no one else there would have noticed unless they had spent too much time learning the shape of him under strain. I forced my voice steady. Then the kingdom is fortunate, I said, looking straight at Oren, that routes appear to care less for pedigree than some ministers do. Lady Hollow's smile faltered. Lord Senward made a sound in his throat that was probably meant to indicate shock and mostly indicated age. Oren's eyes narrowed by a degree. Mechanisms do not govern realms, Miss Belrose. No, I said. People do. That seems to be the problem. Julian turned his head slightly toward me. Not warning. Not quite approval either. Something fiercer and more private than either. Oren, to his credit or his lack of soul, did not lose composure. A spirited answer. I have had a spirited week. That one nearly made Lady Hollow wince. Julian said, enough. He had spoken the word before in council chambers and on decks and in buried stations. It carried differently every time. Here it did not sound like royal impatience. It sounded like a line drawn at last. The minister bowed. As you wish, Your Highness. But the damage had already been done. Nothing in what passed on the terrace was loud enough to scandalize formally. No voices raised. No insult naked enough to be quoted without shame. Yet the meaning would pass through the ballroom in perfect fragments within minutes. The prince danced first with the artisan. The minister reminded him that consorts bind houses and blood. The artisan answered impertinently. The kingdom remained itself. Oren stepped back. Lady Hollow and Lord Senward followed, carrying their polished concern with them like scent. Behind them, the ballroom shifted again to receive the next arrangement, the next conversation, the next careful little injury disguised as public order. Vivienne did not come forward. She only held my gaze once from the threshold before turning to intercept Lady Hollow with a smoothness too practiced to be chance. Whatever she said, I did not hear it. I only saw the older woman's expression change to tight surprise. Julian remained beside me after the others withdrew. For one impossible heartbeat I wished he would say something absurdly reckless. Something that would splinter the ballroom's arithmetic and leave only us. He did not. Of course he did not. That was not who he was. What he did instead was worse for my heart and better for the world. He stayed. He stayed in the silence after the cut, in the cold, clean air above the gardens, with the route lines gleaming over the lower islands and the ballroom light at our backs. He stayed without pretending Oren's words had bounced harmlessly away, without insulting me with easy reassurances about how rank did not matter when it very clearly did, without stepping away to make the terrace easier for anyone else. The music resumed more brightly behind us. It sounded far away. I looked down at my gloved hands, at the silver blue silk over wrists that had known resin, stem cuts, and dry winter cracking. Borrowed dress. Real hands. It was suddenly hard to tell which part hurt more. The palace had dressed me beautifully enough to enter the room. It had not, and could not, make a place for me inside its arithmetic.